Hey, what's going on Facebook Live? I wanted to do a quick pre-election day stream here. There's been a lot going on, and I've been extremely busy doing campaign events and sign waving things and passing out literature and other things just generally related to the campaign. So it's probably a little late in the game here, but I wanted to be sure to document a lot of the things that have happened here over the campaign. And one of the things that just came out a couple of days ago was the endorsement of my opponent by the Everett Herald. And here it is right here. Here we go. I've got the interview recorded for both the Seattle Times and the Everett Herald. But one of the things that I really noticed during the whole process was with the Seattle Times, they gave my opponent the first and the last word. They addressed her as Representative Dewar the whole time, and they addressed me as Adam. But the Everett Herald was a lot more fair in my whole experience, and they gave me the first word as the challenger. They gave her the last word as the incumbent. They addressed her as Representative Dewar, but they addressed me as Mr. Bartholomew. Little things, maybe that's petty, but overall, I felt like the Everett Herald was a lot more even-handed in the way that they covered, especially in the way that they represented me in the final product here. Editorial: Stanford, Dewar, Kloba for the 1st Legislative District. A brief game of musical chairs followed the resignation of 1st Legislative District Senator Guy Palumbo. What they fail to mention here is that he was censured for opposing a capital gains tax and for supporting charter school funding, which the Democrats are vehemently against charter school funding, and they are definitely for new sources of revenue, as they call it in the Progressive Voter Guide. The Democrats definitely want to raise our taxes in Olympia, and that's one of the reasons that Senator Guy Palumbo was censured and ended up ultimately resigning from the state Senate. And then the game of musical chairs that followed was Representative Derek Stanford of Bothell, who was in the first position. He was selected to move up and replace Guy Palumbo, and then they picked Davina Dewar, a Bothell City Council member who still is a city council member for Bothell. So that's, in a lot of people's view, a conflict of interest. I don't live in Bothell. I live in the outskirts of the suburbs of Bothell, if you will. I live in Clearview, and the 1st Legislative District covers Mount Lake Terrace, Briar, Clearview, Echo Lake, Cathcart, and a bunch of little small, rural areas that are not necessarily Bothell. And so somebody who is on the Bothell City Council, how can you be sure that that person is going to be, speaking for the interests of everybody in the district and not just people that are, or not just the interests of Bothell itself? But it says here, district voters will now weigh in on those appointments. In addition to deciding on the election to a third term of the incumbent district's number 2 seat. That's Shelley Kloba. The 1st district, split between Snohomish and King counties, includes the cities of Mount Lake Terrace, Briar, Bothell, and part of Kirkland, and South Snohomish County communities west of High Bridge Road. Senate: Stanford, who has served in his House seat since 2011, has a doctorate in statistics and has worked as a statistician and data science consultant for 20 years. His challenger, Republican Art Coday, is a primary care doctor with past work in biomedical and heart research. He lives in Woodinville. Art Coday actually lives in the district. He lives on the outskirts of Woodinville. The state's response to the coronavirus pandemic illustrates the major differences between these two candidates, and their respective careers inform those stands. Both were interviewed jointly in late September. Coday believes the state has lost its way in response to the pandemic, resulting in harm to the state's economy and to students because of the closure of schools. Both the economy and schools, he said, need to be reopened safely but fully. I agree with that. Stanford approves of a more cautious approach. Stanford basically approves of anything that the state Democrats shove down the legislature. Approves of a more cautious approach taken by the governor and the state and county health officials, and advocates for more emphasis on testing, tracing, and social distancing measures. Both advocate for a special session before the end of the year, but differ on how to address a significant revenue shortfall that has followed the pandemic responses, closures, and restrictions. In the Seattle Times interview, Derek Stanford did not support a special session, and Art Caudet was advocating for that, and I think that Derek Stanford realized his fault later, and that's why he said that he supports that here in the HeraldNet interview. Stanford, who said he's wary of the most recent revenue projections may be too rosy, believes immediate cuts should be avoided. That blows me away that both my opponent and these other two people, Derek Stanford and Shelley Kloba, I think they're all against cuts. Somehow they think that the wrong cuts are going to even worsen the economic downturn. I don't know how that makes sense, but cuts may need to be considered for the coming biennium, he said. But Stanford, as he has in the past, said the state also needs to consider reforms to the state's regressive tax system. Caudet agreed with taking care with cuts, but said reopening the economy and working to keep and attract businesses would accomplish much to replenish state revenues. Caudet also advocates for reductions in taxes and avoiding new taxes, in particular a state income tax. Caudet is also advocating for major reforms to the state's Medicare program, including an increase in reimbursements to providers. As he had in the House, Stanford has continued a record of productivity in his first session in the Senate. He was primary sponsor on more than 20 bills covering topics that included the state's marijuana industry, labor issues, and higher education. Among them were successful legislation that encourages the integration of international medical graduates into the state's healthcare system, and another that limited medical examinations required of injured workers by the state's Department of Labor and Industries, or insurers. Limited medical examinations required. So, made it easier for people to get onto the L&I payrolls, I guess. Stanford, drawing on his background with data, has shown himself to be a pragmatic and reasoned lawmaker who has ably managed the transition from House to Senate. Voters can confidently give him a full 4-year term to continue that representation. House Position 1. In addition to her service on the Bothell City Council, Davina Dewar, who is an architect, also has served on transportation panels, including the state's Transportation Department's Executive Advisory Group and Sound Transit's Bus Rapid Transit Leadership Group. She is challenged by Republican Adam Bartholomew, who lives in Bothell, not true, and works as a service department manager in an automotive dealership. This is his first run for office. Bartholomew said it was his experience in seeing his work closed by the governor's initial stay home, stay healthy order that prompted his run. He opposed his job and that of others being labeled non-essential. Many of our crew didn't come back, he said, even after restrictions began to be lifted. He said he wants to advocate for reopening of the state economy and provide the perspective of someone from the working class. Come on, guys, get a copy editor. This is ridiculous. Dewar, familiar with a number of issues from the district during her service since 2016 on the Bothell Council, said her priorities for her first full term include the state's continuing response to the pandemic and its economic effects, climate change, affordable housing, the district's transportation needs, and reducing gun violence. I think it's funny that they say that here in the end, because during our closing arguments, I brought up the fact that so many people are hurting and haven't received any paycheck, any money at all from the Employment and Securities Department. And her number one priority and her number two priority was the climate. She talks about the wildfires that we had over the summer, and she talks about the climate, and she says and she laughs it off and says, that's a hard thing to talk about during this budget. But if we don't talk about it now, when? Really? I mean, we're in the middle of the worst economic downturn that we've seen in years here in Washington State. Meanwhile, our Washington State's revenue has increased by 70% since the Great Recession in 2009, and the state has not figured out how to work within their means. And everybody wants even more spending. They don't want to do any cuts, and she says specifically that she doesn't want to do any cuts that might further hurt the economy, and she wants a slow and judicious reopening. She doesn't want to reopen our economy, and her number one thing is the environment. She cares more about the environment than the people that are suffering from the economic downturn related to the pandemic. And everybody agreed. I agreed during the first 2 weeks as well that we had to close down because we didn't know enough about this virus. But we soon learned that we were not in the 1918 style pandemic where millions of people were going to die. We're not in that pandemic. And there's a 99.98% chance of surviving this for pretty much anybody under the age of 70. So to think that we still need to continue with these lockdowns and these crazy measures is just absurd. Dewar said lawmakers will need to be cautious about cuts to avoid increasing hardships for the vulnerable and small businesses. Drawing on her work on the city council, Dewar served as vice chairwoman for the House Local Government Committee. She also serves on the committees for transportation and consumer protection and business. In her first session earlier this year, Dewar was a primary sponsor for 12 bills, including one that, while a housekeeping matter, passed legislature and corrected language in the 2005 transportation package. So that has freed up bonding authority for projects in future transportation budgets. Other legislation she has sponsored would add consideration of climate change to the state's Growth Management Act. Another established state-managed retirement savings program and require certain employers to enroll employees. Dewar's performance in the last session showed her to be up to the task and responsibilities. The district and fellow lawmakers will benefit from the voters giving her a full 2-year term. House Position 2. Incumbent Rep. Shelley Kloba, D. Kirkland, is running for her third 2-year term in the House and is challenged by Republican Jeb Brewer. Prior to the primary election, the editorial board endorsed Kloba. Kloba is a former Kirkland City Councilwoman and previously served as legislative director for the state PTA. Brewer, a state resident for 16 years, owns a business advising construction and restaurant industries and is a licensed home inspector. We need Jeb Brewer in the state legislature. He is experienced in the construction business. He's a general contractor, and we need somebody like that knows how to run a small business. One thing that strikes me from all three of these state reps is that none of them, work in the small business, and all of them are career politicians. If you look at the history from all three of them, they've all been in politics. They've all been in state government for years and years, or city government with Kloba and with Davina Dewar. They've just been in city government and then in state government, and they say, one of the things that Davina says in her closing arguments during one of our interviews, she says, I know everybody's suffering right now. Well, she's not suffering. State workers are not suffering at all. They didn't lose any money. They didn't lose any paychecks. And one thing that I've said from the beginning is that we need to talk about budget cuts, and we need to start with the salaries at the top. That means cutting the executive branch salaries. That means cutting the salaries of state workers, because when workers in our state, small business owners and small business workers and people who are just working families and working single mothers and people who just have to work to make a paycheck and earn a living, when they're forced to shut down and declared non-essential, I think it's only fair that state workers and state government should also go without a paycheck, especially when you consider the fact that we had almost $1 billion go overseas to fraud, to Nigerian fraudsters from the Employment Securities Division. The very first thing that should have happened was that the director of the ESD should have been fired for that decision. And I covered that in a previous video. It wasn't an electronic glitch. It wasn't a computer problem. It was a decision to relax security standards that resulted in the fraudsters getting all that money, nearly $1 billion. And they've recovered less than half of that money. But at the end of the day, somebody should have been fired for that. And we all know that in the small business environment, if something like that would have happened, somebody would have paid the price. Somebody would have been fired for that kind of a decision. And none of these people who represent the First District have worked in small businesses and have any real life experience that I think is what we need to have real change here in Washington State. These are career politicians, and they haven't suffered one bit during the shutdown. The most that they've been inconvenienced is having their own kids stuck at home. That's it. And I think that it's only fair when we're talking about budget cuts and things like that. We need to start with the executive branch. We need to start with the leadership at the top by cutting salaries. And then we need to do maybe some forensic accounting and going through the transportation budgets. I mean, the amount of money that gets sunk into our transportation infrastructure here, and we still have gridlock. Even now, during the we had a brief interval there where we had no traffic during my commute. It would just be free flowing, and but even now, we're not even fully reopened, and I'm getting into gridlock on my way to work, and we have some of the worst freeways, just some of the worst places where if you have low profile tires or a car, a fancy car that has really thin rubber on your wheels, you can't drive around Seattle without bending up your wheels. And we have some of the worst roads, but yet we spend tons of money on our transportation infrastructure. And I think that the first thing we need to do is have some forensic audits happening on our transportation department, on our school system. All three of these candidates are endorsed by the school board, and the school boards want to keep our schools closed. They don't care about the science. One thing my opponent talks about is following the science. They don't care about the science. They don't care about the fact that the World Health Organization has now come out and advised against lockdowns. They want to just do what Jay Inslee wants and what the school boards want, which is to keep our schools shut down. And the science shows that we can safely reopen our schools. And one of the things I proposed in our interviews was that children who are at risk and teachers who are at risk can pilot this online learning program, and the rest of the kids and the rest of the teachers should be back in school. We are paying our full tax burden in relation to the schools, but they're remaining closed. And I know it's a lot cheaper for them to stay closed, for them to not have the buses rolling, to not have the kids going back into school, and the building maintenance and the power bills and all the stuff related to having the schools open. But the science is out. The science is clear. We can safely reopen our schools, and anybody who's at risk, anybody who has existing health issues, those people can pilot the online learning program. Any parent that I talk to agrees that it is a total joke. It's a farce. The online learning is ridiculously poor, and the Zoom classes are stupid. And we actually, in our household, we just pulled our kid out of public school, and now we're doing homeschool because the online Zoom classes were so bad. And our kid ends up spending so much time, each teacher ends up spending time trying to convince the other students to turn their cameras on during class. They don't have this figured out. They don't know what they're doing. And we should be able to take the money that the state has allocated for my student and apply that to a school that maybe already has the online learning figured out, or better yet, a school that supports our own family values and our own belief system. One of the reasons that we pulled our student out of class was because of the virtue signaling and the equity classes that are going on, and the teachers wearing a Black Lives Matter badge. They don't care that my wife was assaulted by Black Lives Matter activists during a sign waving event. They don't care about any of that. They don't care about that stuff. They only care about the things that they care about and pushing their agenda onto our students. And so this is the time that we need to send real change. I hope that everybody's got their ballot turned in. I've got my ballot right here. I've been super busy, have not filled it out yet, but I'm going to fill it out tonight. My wife filled out her ballot tonight. We're going to be turning those in. But if you know anybody that has not turned in their ballot, or if you haven't even bothered to check, I would suggest that you spend some time tonight and tomorrow morning texting your friends, texting your neighbors, go and knock on your neighbor's door, and motivate 2 other people to get out and turn in their ballots. I was doing some doorbelling over the weekend with Dr. Art Codet, and about a third of the houses that we went to had not turned in their ballots. Some people hadn't even thought about it, really. Some people weren't going to vote. I talked to a guy today that was kind of shrugging his shoulders. He's like, I don't know if my vote really matters. And I can tell you, your vote matters this year. This is the year that your vote matters in Washington State. It matters more this year than ever before. And we need to have a real surge of support out there to get Lauren Culp and Joshua Freed into the governor and lieutenant governor's positions, because we really need to make a change here in Washington State, and we need leaders that are going to support our Constitution and support our rights and not be shutting down our economy and telling people that we can't go to work. My opponent talks about in her closing argument that we didn't know that the human papillomavirus was super bad, and now people are getting cancer from it. So we're going to shut down the economy for that? We're going to shut down the economy because of a virus that we don't know about? We all agreed that 2 weeks to slow the spread made sense. But then after that, the game changed. They're constantly changing the game, and now it's not about slowing the spread or overrunning the hospitals. That never happened. The hospitals never got overrun. And then what happened was, here in Washington State, is the hospitals started laying people off, and hospital workers started losing their jobs because the hospitals had shut down elective procedures, and Jay Inslee didn't have that in his plan for reopening. And so people ended up losing their jobs. Instead of the hospitals being overrun, they've been completely empty for a long time. We turned Safeco Field into an emergency military hospital, didn't get one patient. And I think that happened to a number of cities around the nation. So they keep on moving the goalposts, changing the game, and now it's not about hospitalizations or death count. Now it's just about cases. It's just about case numbers. And the more cases, the more they want to justify another lockdown over our economy and more control over our lives. And that's not right. That's not what America is about. That's not what our Constitution is for. And I think that the governor and our entire state legislature has overstepped their power and their authority, and we need to change that. And this is the year that your vote matters. So if you know anybody, or if you yourself haven't turned in your ballot, please do so. And please get out. I've done a lot of work passing out literature and campaigning, but at the end of the day, each of us can touch a couple of voters that might not be otherwise we might not be able to otherwise connect with through traditional means. So open up your phone, get in your phone book, get in your email box, think about your neighbors, think about the neighbor that you have next door to you that isn't really politically involved, that's really more concerned about the Seahawks game than the election, and get that person to turn in their ballot, because tomorrow is the last day for us to actually make a real change here in Washington State.